Do you remember when everyone was blindsided by Trump's 2016 victory? History might be about to repeat itself. In this video, we're going to uncover the hidden force that polls keep missing, the silent majority. You're going to learn why millions of voters aren't showing up in the data and how this could lead to another election night shocker. Don't be left in the dark. This is information that every voter needs to know. I'm Evan Goldstein. I'm a licensed professional engineer and a data scientist. I'm making the AI Capitalist channel to help leaders like you understand the hidden meaning behind the numbers in our data-saturated world. Are we about to relive 2016 all over again? Now, I don't do my own political views on this channel. It's not what it's about. But I'm going to tell you about an anonymous friend of mine. Back in 2016, my friend and a bunch of other friends threw this big party to celebrate Hillary Clinton winning before the election results had been announced. He was convinced that she had it in the bag. And they were all left speechless when she didn't pull it off. And this whole vibe feels familiar to me right now, like we're hitting the end of a familiar tune. Female candidate, polls are showing her ahead against an orange, bombastic fellow. If you're into social science and polling, or you just took a few college classes on the stuff, you've probably heard of the biggest polling flop in US history. I'm talking about the 1936 Literary Digest poll that completely blew it by predicting that the Republican candidate, Alf Landon, was going to crush Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the presidential race. The reality was that Roosevelt crushed it, and he took almost every state. No one even thinks about Landon anymore. And the Literary Digest went belly up less than 2 years later, completely humiliated. Students always hear this tale about how Literary Digest messed up their poll results. And it's such a big deal that it's even mentioned in the Digest's Wikipedia page. The Digest poll flopped because they had a biased sample. Their contact list was packed with more Republicans than Democrats, and they used their own readers, mostly from the upper class. Their sample came from phone records and car owners, typically belonging to wealthier people. The whole mess meant too many Republicans were counted, skewing the numbers for Landon. This story has been making the rounds in academic circles for ages because it's a solid way to teach students why bad sampling can really bite you in the butt. The way the Literary Digest ran their poll was pretty much the opposite of how George Gallup pulled off his own poll. Gallup, the small-time pollster, nailed the election results by chatting with just 50,000 people, while the Digest went big, polling 10 million and hearing back from over 2 million. Yet they still couldn't get it right, despite this huge sample size. It turned into a real wake-up call, pushing the polling world to shake up its methodology. The idea of Landon winning was so tempting that folks in the field just wanted to make it fit their narrative. At best, it was a nice story we told ourselves, and at worst, it was a complete hogwash. The team at the Digest saw the writing on the wall, and they tried to tell folks something was off with the poll. But no one paid them any mind, and by 1938, the magazine had sunk, taking its reputation down with it. Big names take a tumble, and it's not often anyone pays attention to what they have to say while they're crashing down. So I want to share thoughts from a Literary Digest writer who's fed up with readers flooding the magazine with excuses for why their poll flopped. The writer stated that he had done his diligence, polled the lower strata of society, and every kind of registered voter. The results were just as bad as the national poll in these smaller statewide polls. The Digest had a few things to say in its defense. In the 1936 poll, it was just business as usual for them. They've always been able to nail accurate results in every election since they started polling in 1916. Their poll reached the left-behind folks in a lot of areas. Even there, the results still leaned toward the Republican candidate. In the election, Roosevelt scored a win even with the rich folks who were voting. So if they had left out the lower class from their poll, the results shouldn't have leaned towards Landon at all. We have a bit of a mystery here. The Literary Digest was stuck with their usual methods, but this time they flopped. On the flip side, Gallup hit the nail right on the head with his election predictions. The simplest way to look at this is to think that the Digest had a flaw that Gallup managed to dodge. And maybe in 1936, there was something unique about that election that brought out that flaw. What exactly was the trigger? If there was a trigger, we really want to figure it out. It could have helped us to see Clinton's loss in 2016 coming. Plus, it might give us some insight into how Harris is looking right now in actual reality. The big reason the 1936 Literary Digest poll flopped was enormous popularity of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was super popular, and because of that, it just made Landon look way more popular in the polls than he really was. First, if you want to help me steer more viewers to AI Capitalist, I would urge you to hit the like button. Hitting lets me know that I'm making the kind of content that you want to see, and it helps spread that content. The Literary Digest poll was a massive poll. They sent out 10 million and got 2.38 million back. That's a large number, but 2.38 million people is only 23.8% of the actual total number of people polled. That's a big red flag. So few people chiming in raises questions about what made those who participated different from those who didn't. This is termed response bias. It means that a certain group of people, like Landon fans, are more likely to fill out a survey compared to others, like Roosevelt supporters. Research has shown that response bias was the big reason why the Literary Digest didn't hit the mark. Only around 1 in 5 Roosevelt supporters agreed to take the survey, while roughly 1 in 3 Landon fans were all in. Most folks seem to agree that the response bias, along with the overly fancy sample, really tanked the Digest's credibility. But there's still one big question. Why did that response bias favor Alf Landon? What made Landon supporters so pumped to jump on the Digest straw poll while Roosevelt fans didn't chime in? Shouldn't it have been the opposite? Most of the material I've read just skips over why the Digest thought that Landon had a better shot than Roosevelt. It feels like it's such a basic part of the story that nobody finds it worth digging into for some reason. Why does that question even matter? It could totally relate to how polls are working today. We really want to figure out if the polls are hyping up Harris's shot at being president or if they're boosting Trump's chances instead. Considering what's happened in the last couple of elections, with Trump way overperforming in polls, it's pretty safe to say that it's more about Harris. But the real question is, why is it happening? Looking back at what I mentioned earlier, I've got a theory about why those polls were so messed up. I think it boils down to people using the polls to express themselves. The sort of polls as expression idea. It just means that people really want to chat about their political opinions. But if they're in a place where they think their views won't be welcome, they might hold back from sharing or backing them up in public. So when a pollster shows up, it's like they open the door for people to share their thoughts with someone who's actually listening, and they usually take that chance. You can totally make a bunch of predictions from this simple idea. For example, in super Republican areas, polls are likely to give Democrats more credit than they deserve. In really Democrat-heavy areas, polls are probably going to hype up how well Republicans are going to perform. In hotly contested areas, like the battleground states, the polls are likely to be pretty on point. National polls should show this bias in action. If a lot of states are hyping up how well Democrat candidates are doing, then you can bet that the national polls are going to downplay how good they're actually performing. If this is the case, then there's also quite a few useful implications that come from this as to how to make better estimates from polls. Even big shots aren't convinced that there's a consistent issue with polling errors in elections. Nate Silver mentioned this in an article he dropped a couple of weeks ago, saying that his model treats errors like they're all over the place instead of following a pattern. If I'm onto something here, it looks like the reasons that pushed Roosevelt to win by a landslide are pretty much the same reasons that made the Digest polls go totally off the rails. The folks at the Digest clearly felt that something was off, and they thought that others would be aware. The people at the Digest saw the red lights flashing, realized they had a problem, and tried to alert others, but they got brushed aside by the academic crowd. Instead of listening, those scholars used them as a cautionary tale, ignoring the real issues for years. Some of the first pieces about why the Digest totally nailed the reasons behind it. But those articles got drowned out by a flood of self-serving voices, people who spun the narrative that suited their careers, even when they had proof that contradicted their story. So when we look at the data from the 2020 election, you'll notice something interesting. Those super Republican states totally overshot how well Biden was going to do. Don't get me wrong, those polls still had Trump coming out on top, but they weren't totally off base. They did predict that Biden would lose by a smaller margin than he actually ended up losing by. And on the flip side, when we check out the Democrat-heavy areas, the errors aren't as wild. The District of Columbia, the most Democrat place you can think of, is one of the few spots that actually overestimated Trump's performance. There's a pattern brewing here, and it's worth digging into. If we're comparing 2024 to 1936, a lot's changed in the intervening almost 100 years, right? We're a much more national country. There are Trump-heavy areas and Biden-heavy areas. Or not Biden, but there are definitely Trump-heavy areas and there are Kamala Harris-heavy areas. But there's also a national scene and a national media. When you see a lot of the shaming of people who are leaning Republicans, it does seem like when Hillary referred to her opponent's voters as deplorables, that has the effect of making you feel, even if you're in a Republican-heavy area, like you're in Democrat-heavy country. And so it's going to tend to force the same sort of bias or response bias on a national level, even in areas that aren't Democrat. And I think that explains why Trump came out ahead and why the polls were so wrong about him in both elections, and possibly in this one too.